second plenary of the 60th anniversary Congress of the Society for French Historical Studies. It's a tremendous pleasure to see people here, to see so many people here, so many people I know from many years as a French historian. It's a particular pleasure to welcome the people in the front row, the three plenary speakers, plus Professor Clark, of whom I'll say something in a few minutes, the Consul General of France, the Consul General of the United Kingdom, and the Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Director of the Goethe Institute, and various other luminaries whose names I shall not mention from Concordia University and from UCAM. So thank you all very much for coming. This afternoon's plenary lecture, second plenary lecture by Professor Clark is entitled France and the Origins of the Great War. Professor Clark is an extremely well-known figure on the international historical scene at the present with regard to the question of the origins of the Great War. He's Professor of Modern European History and Fellow of St. Catherine's College, Cambridge. He is actually an Australian by birth, did his BA honours at the University of Sydney before going to Cambridge, where he took his PhD. He is a German historian, but that should not prevent us from enjoying what he has to say. I had the pleasure of attending a lecture that he gave at the Maison Heinrich Heine in Paris in January, and it was an absolutely stellar performance, auf Deutsch. I've since heard him on, I think it was TF1 in France, a debate with a variety of French historians and French journalists. It was also very interesting. And he acquitted himself remarkably well in his third language, French. So I think we're in for a treat this afternoon. His main publications include a book called Iron Kingdom, The Rise and Downfall of Prussia, 1600 to 1947, which was published by by Harvard University Press, in 2006, and a biography of Kaiser Wilhelm II, subtitled A Life in Power, also published by Alan Lane and Penguin in 2009. His most recent book is the book that is creating quite the furor, quite the wave of interest in Europe, particularly in Germany, where I understand it's selling like hotcakes. It's entitled The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914, and that is, of course, of particular interest to us at this conference. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Professor Clark to lecture to us on France and the origins of the Great War. Thank you.
Je vous remercie, Norman, pour vos paroles très généreuses. Aussi le comité exécutif de la Society of French Historical Studies pour l'invitation à ce congrès passionnant. C'est mon premier séjour à Montréal, et puis c'est-à-dire au Canada francophone. Et je dois avouer que dès ma jeunesse, la francophonie américaine m'a toujours fasciné. Quand j'étais petit, je me suis toujours demandé pourquoi les Australiens n'ont-ils pas aussi une province française. J'avais l'impression de souffrir sous une injustice historique. Ça aurait sûrement enrichi et raffiné notre vie nationale. I'd also like to thank the German Consulate General in Montreal for sponsoring this session, though please allow me to insist and to reassure you that that does not mean that the French Foreign Office is paying for me in any sense. The German Foreign Office, I'm sorry, is paying me for me in any sense, a charge which has been laid at my shoes from several quarters. And I'd like to add that I'm as someone who normally passes for a German historian, Norman Ingram has kindly already referred to that, I feel particularly privileged and pleased to be standing here in an assembly of French historical scholars. I feel a little bit like the unfortunate crew of a German Zeppelin Luftschiff, an airship which accidentally floated across the border in 1913 and made a forced landing on the French side of the border, only to find themselves surrounded by hostile villagers bearing pitchforks. But there's been none of that. There's been a bit of cheek pinching and hair stroking, but nothing beyond that. And I'm delighted to be here and at the cordial way in which you've received me. Okay, so I wanted to begin by telling you something you all know already, which is that on the morning of the 28th of June, 1914, when Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, the heir apparent to the Austrian throne, and his wife, Sophie Chotek, arrived in Sarajevo, at Sarajevo railway station, to make a visit to this rather quaint and oriental city on the periphery of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Europe was at peace. That's something you all know. And indeed, if one had asked the statesmen of that era, that month, if one had asked the best informed statesmen of Europe whether they believed a major war was likely, was in prospect, then the great majority of them would have told you that no. In fact, in recent weeks, months, and indeed in the last year and a half, a major war had been becoming less likely rather than more likely. And we have the very eloquent testimony of Arthur Nicholson, a senior functionary at the British Foreign Office, who remarked at the end of May, nota bene, in 1914, and these are the words he used. He said, since the time that I've been at the British Foreign Office, I have never seen such calm international waters. That was the end of May 1914. And yet, of course, as you all know, 37 days later, Europe was at war, and out of that European war emerged, or that European war evolved into a world war, which has rightly been described by, by many different historians, by German historians in particular, as the Urkatastrophe, the primal catastrophe of the 20th century, the catastrophe that disfigured this century before it was 20 years old. It consumed 4 major empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the German Empire. Far more importantly, it consumed the lives of at least, there are not good global statistics, but at least 10 million military young soldiers, possibly up to 20 million lives if we include all civilian casualties as well and deaths from disease. It caused, of course, between 15 and 21 million, again, the statistics are not good, seriously wounded. And in fact, I'm talking here about serious wounds. Light wounds treated in theater have never been counted, but serious wounds came to many millions. And of course, many of these wounds had life-changing effects. They changed the appearance of many of the men who suffered from them. And of course, the appearance of a gueule cassée, of men with facial mutilations, with amputations and so on, was something that very much marked the visual memory of this war in all of the belligerent states. And I think Fritz Stern, the American, German emigre historian, was right when he commented that it's from this catastrophe that all the other disasters of the 20th century spring. It's very hard to imagine the rise of fascism in Italy without this war. It's hard to imagine the October Revolution of the Bolsheviks in Russia. It's very easy to imagine the February Revolution. Very many contemporaries had predicted something like the February Revolution, a swift transfer of power, a collapse of Tsarism, a seizure of power by some kind of coalition of centrist, nationalist, Kadyet, and possibly moderate leftist elements in Russian politics, but no one had predicted the Bolshevik coup, the creation of a one-party state, and of course the Russian Civil War that followed, consuming a further 5 million or so lives. And of course it's hard to imagine the rise of National Socialism, and therefore also of the Holocaust, the outcome, the carrying out of the appalling Nazi genocide against the Jews and against other ethnic groups, without the stimulus of this first disaster. And so I think my former colleague at Cambridge, now teaching at Yale University, Adam Tooze, who's just published a book, I don't know if it's actually out in public yet, but it's certainly in press, called The Deluge, about the outcome of this war. I think he's right when he speaks of this war as an event that unhinged the global system, with effects that are still in some parts of the world, the Middle East in particular, being felt today. And so the question of how all this came about, it follows from all this that the question of how all this came about possesses a certain intrinsic interest. And I don't want to disappoint you, but I'm not the first person to have noticed that. This is an old debate. The American historian John Langdon did a count in 1991 in a really good book called The Long Debate. I mean, the title is, in a sense, the thesis of the book. And he counted 25,000 books and articles in English that one really must read if one wants to be abreast of this debate. And of course, since then, many more have appeared. And one's put in mind, really, of Rebecca West, the author of one of the deepest reflections on the place of the Balkans in 20th century European history. I'm thinking of her remarkable book, Black Lamb, Grey Falcon, a kind of mixed, hybrid, multi-genre text, partly memoir, partly history, partly travelogue, a sort of intimate diary of her impressions, but also a really deeply historical and intelligent historical reflection on the Balkans. And in that book, Rebecca West recalls visiting Sarajevo in 1937. She went there with her husband, or more precisely with one of her husbands, they went up, they climbed the stairs up to the little balcony at the front of the city hall of Sarajevo, and they stood in the place where Franz Ferdinand had stood before he left this city and had looked out over its handsome skyline with the many minarets. There were over 100 minarets that could be seen. And she turned to her husband and she said, "I shall never understand how it all came to pass. It's not that we know too little, it's that we know too much." And of course, we know a great deal more today. And so anyone writing on this subject is liable to encounter skepticism from colleagues. And this was certainly my case in Cambridge. I remember one colleague in particular who asked me, not once, but many times over, why on earth are you writing a book about this subject? Surely this has been done to death. I mean, if there's one problem that's been resolved, this has surely got to be it. And that's a marvelous thing about one's colleagues, of course, as I'm sure you're all aware, that just as one is struggling with the cruelties of a really difficult problem, they come up with excellent reasons why one should curl up and die. Well, I won't deny that I sometimes curled up, but I didn't die. I'm still here. I haven't died yet. And of course, there has to be an answer to this question. We have to find one, and I did find one. And the answer is that although the debate is old, it certainly is old, it's as old as the war. In fact, it's slightly older than the war, because the argument over who was responsible for bringing this war into the world began before the first shots were fired. And it's amazing how many of the theses you find in the literature, I mean, the great majority of them, you can find on the lips of those men, those statesmen and politicians who brought this war into the world, as they all pointed the finger at each other and came up with refined historical explanations of why they themselves were not responsible for the disaster that was in prospect. And it's the case, I think, that, so of course the debate is old, but it seems to me that although the debate is old, the subject is still fresh. And indeed, in many ways, it's fresher now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Now, in the 1970s, when I first encountered this subject matter as a schoolboy in Sydney, at Sydney Grammar School, a certain amount of period charm had accumulated around the story of Europe's last summer, as David Fromkin called it. There were the wonderful narrative histories of Barbara Tuchman, which was what one read then, and we read it with tremendous passion and interest. I mean, they are magnificent books, and I still strongly recommend them to everyone. But Tuchman's accounts were like history paintings. They dwelt lovingly on the details of uniforms. There was Lord Salisbury riding to the House of Commons on London's first pneumatically wheeled tricycle, pushed by his valet James through Hyde Park. And when they got to the little hills, they are only very little, he would say, "Let go, James, let go." And he would roll down and his coattails would be doing this. And there was a great deal on sumptuous menus at gala dinners and details about the Baroque exuberance of Habsburg court occasions and detailed regimentation about where the babies of different princesses were allowed to be presented in their prams and this kind of thing. And it was all about the ornamentalism of this world of hereditary monarchy, the last sort of grotesque Baroque blooming, the late blooming of European court cultures. And the assumption stealthily asserted itself that if these people's helmets had gaudy green ostrich feathers on them, then perhaps their dreams and thoughts and arguments also had green ostrich feathers. Perhaps these were people of a bygone world, of a moribund world, people who could no longer speak to us in a direct way, whose words would no longer mean very much to us. But viewed from our perspective, the perspective not of the 1970s, but of the early-ish 21st century, one cannot help but be struck by the raw modernity of the events of 1914. Think of the fact that they begin not with prancing horses and carriages, but with a cavalcade of automobiles. It's very difficult when you run through your mind the events on the Appel Quay on the 28th of June 1914 in Sarajevo. It's very difficult not to have flickering at the back of your mind those famous films of Dallas in November 1963. These events began with a squad of suicide bombers And these young men, or they were scarcely more than boys, who carried out the assassinations, they were suicide bombers in a very literal sense. They'd been instructed to take their own lives after completing their mission, and indeed the two most active members of the 7-man squad in Sarajevo, Nedeljko Čabrinović and Gavrilo Princip, both attempted to commit suicide with the potassium cyanide that they had. But the poison was of bad quality, it had degraded, and all it did was burn the inside of their throats and stomachs, as you know, so that it made them sick but didn't kill them. So it began with a squad of suicide bombers, and when I first encountered these figures as a schoolboy, they seemed very exotic figures, shut off in a very remote past, like ancient Egypt. But of course, today the suicide bomber is a familiar figure for all kinds of reasons. And backing up these young men, or standing behind them, was an underground network with fuzzy structures, only loosely linked to any sovereign political entity, with no paper trails, operating in small cells with very limited knowledge of each other's activities. And there again, there are obvious contemporary parallels. And our compass has shifted in other ways as well. There's the fact that since the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, it makes less sense, it seems to me, than it used to, simply to write the Balkans out of the story of how this war came about. I mean, it's an odd and paradoxical feature of the great majority of books written on the origins of the First World War, that although they concede that the Balkans are the theater for the crisis that starts the war off, they took no interest in the Balkans as participating and contributing in any sense, the sort of dynamics, the political dynamics of the Balkans, as contributing in any sense to that war's coming about. And then there's the fact that the events of 9/11 reminded us of the power of an event. And this is an important point, because the event has sometimes, as a kind of causal category, and as French historians, you know that better than anyone else, has sometimes fallen out of fashion with historians. But sometimes events can be important. Of course, we have to embed them in historical processes. We have to see how they're freighted with symbolic content, as indeed this assassination on the 28th of June was. But nevertheless, events can sometimes be structuring. They can change structures. They can change the chemistry of politics. You think of that very useful category, the événement structurant, and that, I think, is something that applies very neatly to the assassinations, or the twin assassinations of the 28th of June. And then there's the fact that we're only just coming to terms with the fact that the Cold War is over. We're only beginning to work out what it means that we're now in a multipolar world, no longer a world of bipolar stability, disciplined by the standoff between two nuclear hyperpowers, but rather a world of rising powers, and a world with a sort of weary titan. The weary titan in 1914 was supposedly Great Britain. Washington is sometimes viewed today as a weary titan, or at least a titan that, though not necessarily in decline in terms of its objective dominance, nevertheless is wearying of its global commitments. It's a world which is increasingly unpredictable, and in that respect, too, our world resembles more and more 1914, or to put it a different way, the world of 1914 speaks to us in a more and more direct and intimate way, certainly more so than it did in the 1970s. And these shifts in perspective prompt us to rethink the story of how war came to Europe in 1914. Accepting that challenge does not mean, and I want to stress this, it's a very important distinction, it does not mean embracing a vulgar presentism that remakes the past to meet the needs of the present. Rather, it means acknowledging those features of the past of which our changed vantage point affords us a clearer view. Of course, we have to be honest, and that's what I'm trying to do by mentioning these contemporary, the features of the contemporary world. We have to be honest about the ways in which the present pressures us, or imposes a kind of pressure on our perception of the past. But we also have to acknowledge that the changes in our contemporary vantage point give us the privilege, or the opportunity to see aspects of the past that were not there. Of course, we have to be careful that we're not simply projecting onto the past contemporary preoccupations. And bearing all this in mind, how does one then go about refreshing a narrative like this, especially one that has engaged so many distinguished scholarly minds? Well, in my own account of this problem, I tried to do this in various ways, and I want to dwell just on a couple of those. One was to change the question, not to think in advance about how I might change the answer, because that didn't seem to me the right way to go about it, but rather to change the question. In other words, and what I tried to do was, instead of asking why this war came into the world, was to ask instead, how did it come into the world? Now, questions of why and how are not logically disconnectable. You can't actually extricate them from each other. Nevertheless, questions about why push us in slightly different directions from questions about how. They push us in search of remote causes, categories, nationalism, imperialism, armament stockpiles, the spread of social Darwinism, the rise of a Soviet chauvinist public sphere. These are familiar categories from the literature on the origins of the First World War. But there's a problem with this piling up of categories. And that is that as you pile them up, as you achieve this sort of piling effect, the scale tilts from a possible war to a probable war to an inevitable war. There's an illusion of a steadily building causal pressure, a bit like magma gathering under a major volcano, and in the end it's got to come out. The war, it has to issue in some kind of conflict. And what happens is that the executors, the agents, the actors, very powerful men who actually made the choices and decisions that brought this war about, are squeezed out of the field of vision. They become mere executors of nameless causes. So I wanted to get away from this illusion of steadily building pressure, because a lot of the most interesting writing on the outbreak of this war has suggested on the contrary, and I'm thinking here of the work of Holger Afflerbach and of Friedrich Kiesling, but of others as well, that in many ways this war was becoming less likely before it became more likely. Friedrich Kiesling wrote an excellent book about détente as an authentic feature of the pre-war international system. He argued that periods of détente were not simply interruptions in an inevitable road to war, but that they represented a genuine potentiality of the system, which could sometimes create periods of relaxation in which war appeared to, or perhaps even really did, recede to the horizons of possibility. And Holger Afflerbach, in a book called The Improbable War, focused on features of the pre-war environment which didn't anticipate the war of 1914 to 18, but anticipated other futures. Because, of course, the pre-war was just as pregnant in a multiplicity, a plurality of futures as our present today is. A second point about why and how questions is one made by a Bulgarian historian of the Balkan Wars, who put it rather nicely when he said, once we ask the question why, guilt soon becomes the focal point. In other words, when we ask why, what we often really mean is who. Who did this? We must find the guilty party. A blame-based approach obliges us, of course, to draw up a charge sheet, to inculpate a particular state, or conversely, to exonerate a state. So we'll always be looking for evidence for a particular viewpoint. And a classic example of this is the Fisher thesis. Now, an important point has to be made about this. The psychogram, the portrait of the political elites that Fischer drew, not just in his first work, Deutschlands Griff nach der Weltmacht, but also in subsequent books in which he steadily radicalized his claims for Germany's virtually sole culpability in the outbreak of this war. The portrait that he drew of the German political elites was not wrong, was not an inaccurate one, and it's still a powerful and disturbing image of what was going on in the kind of mind of many of the key decision makers, in particular senior military figures, people from the far right of German politics, and so on. What I think was problematic about Fischer's thesis was simply its overwhelmingly German focus. Fischer was only interested in Germany. He wasn't interested in the other European states. I mean, it's asking a lot to expect Fischer to do in the kind of depth he did for Germany, to do a similar operation on other states. That would be asking a great deal indeed. But what's lost nonetheless, when one approaches the matter in this way, is the interaction among powers that was such an important part, in my view, of the explanation for how this war came about. And you can see how this approach, the Fischer sort of one-state, culpability-based approach, or the forensic approach, if you like, you can see how this approach pans out more widely if you look at the Macmillan series, the kind of canonic series on the origins of the First World War, a wonderful series of books, country-by-country studies by Zara Steiner, who did Britain. Though Zara's interesting because her book, she had started on this material before the Fischer thesis became known, and so her work is in some ways pre-Fischer, and that's very interesting to look at the series in that way and to contrast her approach with that of the others. But the others, Volker Berghahn, who wrote about Germany and the origins of the First World War and took a Fischerian line, John Keeger on France, you had Richard Bosworth on Italy, Dominic Lieven on Russia, and so on. you can see the very deep impact of Fisher on virtually all the books of this series. John Keeger's excellent study on France, which is fantastic on the relationship between domestic politics and foreign policy, has a great analysis of Poincaré, as one would expect. He's a great expert on Poincaré. He wrote a wonderful biography of Poincaré. His analysis of Poincaré as a phenomenon in French politics and public life is second to none. It's really superb. But note his insistence that France, as he puts it, was completely passive in the pre-war crises. It played no proactive role whatsoever, as he describes it. There's a tension also in Dominic Lieven's wonderful account of Russian foreign policy down to 1914. He gives a very subtle account of how the forces engaged in trying to define Russian foreign policy, particularly vis-à-vis the Balkans. Though we have also an expert on this. I've been trying to find him. Ronald Bobroff is out there somewhere. We have an expert on this subject in this room. But in any case, Lieven gives a very differentiated account of these issues. But it sits in a slightly tense relationship with his assertion towards the end of the book that since Fisher has clarified the issue of responsibility for the war, there's no need to delve into this question from the Russian perspective. Fisher has shown it was the Germans, so we can assume that whatever the Russians are up to, it had nothing to do with them. So what's lost when one approaches matters in this way is the multilaterality of developments before 1914. And yet some of the best recent writing, it seems to me, reflecting as it does a kind of globalization of the field of vision, has focused exactly on that. If you think of the works of Keith Wilson and Keith Nielsen, for example, or of Thomas Otte on the China question, who's shown how complexly these great powers are interacting, who've depicted a world before 1914 in which all of the powers have more than one enemy. They always have to balance the demands, the imperatives of different hostile potential threats. It's a threat-rich environment. Or I think of Patricia Weitzman on the complex origins of the Franco-Russian alliance. She showed that Russia's reasons for joining France in the Franco-Russian alliance had only in part to do with Germany. They also had to do with the desire to deny Britain a relationship with France, and also to to counter the possibility of Britain's joining the Triple Alliance, which at that time, improbable as it seems in retrospect, was something that St. Petersburg was very worried about. So there's a lot of triangulation going on. In the case of British policy, Nielsen and Wilson have shown how difficult and yet how important it was for the British to balance the need to appease Russia with the need to oppose Germany. I mean, that was their choice. Oppose Russia and appease Germany, or oppose Germany and appease Russia. It was never just about one threat. So that multilaterality is very, very important, and it gets totally lost to view in the country-by-country approach. But of course, as you know, my brief today is to focus on France and the origins of the First World War, as is appropriate in a gathering of French historians. So there's a tension here between the kind of approach that I believe is best geared to capture the dynamics of the war's etiology and the one-state focus, and which is, of course, a function of the way we still do European history. This is, after all, a French history conference, and later this year I'll be going to the German Studies Association. I mean, we are still doing these things through a nation-state framework. So what I propose to do is to reflect briefly on French nodes, if you like, in the tangle of developments that made this war possible, or at least explain why it broke out in the way that it did. And there are various ways in which one could do this. One could sort of string together a sequence of episodes in which the French government acts proactively, creating new international situations. You could explore, for example, as if it were necessary, I mean, again, you could return to the first Moroccan crisis. You could look at how French policy in North Africa acquired a specifically anti-German twist, as Delcasse decided to buy everybody else off. The Spaniards, the British, of course, that was part of the deal with Britain, was that you were swapping Egypt for Morocco. They bought off the Italians with the promise of the future position in Libya. The only people that Delcasse refused to consult over his policy in Morocco were the Germans. So he gave his policy, and Chris Andrew wrote a wonderful book about this, appeared a long time ago before he became an intelligence historian. He wrote this book about Delcasse in which he showed the reasoning behind this move. One could then revisit the second Moroccan, or the so-called Agadir crisis. And here we have Jean-Claude Alain's magnificent study of Agadir, supported by Mark Haynes's work. an Australian historian, somewhat underappreciated, wrote a study of French foreign policy, of the sort of mechanisms of French foreign policy making. And both of these historians showed how French handling of Morocco was shaped in the course of 1911 by a faction of relatively Germanophobe figures around Maurice Herbet within the centrale of the Quai d'Orsay, amongst the permanent functionaries of the Quai d'Orsay. And of course, one could, if one wanted to buy into this kind of approach, one could link this to a set of arguments about instability at the apex of the French political system. John Keeger has written very well about that. He's particularly good on the extraordinarily toxic relationships between the agencies entrusted in Paris with the interception and decryption of diplomatic traffic, and senior ministers such as Joseph Caillot, but also foreign ministers such as Justin de Sèvres and Stéphane Pichon. One could explore the tense relationship between the permanent functionaries of the Centrale and the foreign ministers, sometimes the ambassadors too. One might note that during Sir Edward Grey's tenure as Foreign Secretary in Britain, no fewer than 16 French foreign ministers came and went. 2 of them came and went twice, which is quite an achievement. And one could point to the role of the Agadir crisis, but in stimulating or triggering Italy's unprovoked attack on the lands now known as Libya, the 3 vilayets of Cyrenaica, Tripolitania, and Fezzan in 1911, a war that was in many ways an important way station to the War of 1914, because it flashed a green light to the Balkan states, saying it was effectively a message to the Balkan states saying, you know, you can, if anybody's interested in tearing bits out of the Ottoman Empire, now is the moment to do so. In 1921, rather, when he looked back over the origins of the war and reflected on this in a conversation with a French journalist in Paris, the former chief of the political department of the Serbian Foreign Ministry, a man called Miroslav Spalajkovic, commented when he looked back at the Italian war on Libya, he said, "Ça, c'était la première agression." That was the first aggression. Out of that moment followed the Balkan Wars and the Great War. And Stéphane Pichon said something similar, the former foreign minister, when he commented in 1916, looking back on the Italian war. He said that this was, he said that this is how it came about. Italy wanted Tripolitania. That brought the Italian-Ottoman War. Then the Balkan states raised their war flags under the protection of Russia. Tout cela s'est déroulé d'une manière fatale. But you can see already that we have a problem. This is already looking like a kind of charge sheet against Paris, partly because I presented these French government actors as proactive agents. If they weren't, of course, they wouldn't be part of my story. If they were irrelevant to how this war came about, they wouldn't be there in the first place. And partly because in order to evoke such moments under the rubric France and the origins of the First World War, we have to isolate them from their highly dynamic setting, in which they are both reactive and proactive. This is the real problem with the one-nation approach, that you end up stringing different episodes together. And what's more, by listing these moments in chronological order, we create an almost irresistible illusion that a coherent intention, an aggressive, belligerent intention, underlies these interventions, that something is evolving in an irreversible way. It would be nice if one could, temporarily of course, simply evacuate the chronology from the analysis and think of those moments not as a chronological sequence leading to the telos of war, but rather as discrete pieces of causality, like those biological images in which a dye is used to highlight certain discrete parts of an organism that possess an analogical function. So bearing that in mind, bearing that caveat in mind, and I really do want to sort of keep that, maintain an awareness of that, let me dwell just on one last piece of causality before I conclude, while at the same time striving not to overstate its explanatory force, its causal importance. Nevertheless, it belongs in the story, but I don't want to overstate its causal or its determining importance. And I'm thinking here of the deepening French interest, and this is the matter on which I know Ronald Bobroff is more expert than I, but I'm thinking here of the deepening French interest during the autumn and winter of 1912 in what one could call a Balkan inception scenario. The preparedness, in principle at least, to accept in advance that if Russia should feel obliged to intervene on the Balkan Peninsula, in the event of some kind of quarrel between Austria and one of its Balkan neighbors, of course, the state one had in mind was obviously Serbia, that if this should happen, France would view this, even if Russia itself were not directly under threat of attack, as a casus foederis, as an event triggering the Franco-Russian alliance, a state of affairs triggering the activation of the alliance with its parallel mobilizations and so on. And I want to open up this fragment with a conversation that took place in Paris on the 19th of December 1912 between Colonel Ignatieff, the Russian military attaché in Paris, and Alexandre Millerand, the French Minister of War. Millerand raised the question of Austrian troop reinforcements along the Serbian border. One has to remember that in the winter of 1912-13, the whole of Europe wondered whether a war was about to break out. There was a very tense situation in the Balkans. The Russians had sent troop reinforcements to the Galician border with Austria-Hungary in order to deter the Austrians from intervening in the war unfolding in the Balkans. And the Austrians had responded, as one would expect them to, with a counter-mobilization, and the numbers of the troops were going up on both sides. I mean, forgive me for the contemporary parallels, resonances, but in any case, there was tension about this. And against that background, Millerand asked Ignatieff, as well indeed he might, Minister of War, what he thought was the objective of the Austrian mobilization. Ignatieff responded, well, predictions are difficult on this question, but undoubtedly the Austrian preparations vis-à-vis Russia have so far been defensive in character. So a very cautious response to the question from Millerand. But Millerand then presses him further. What do you think, he asks, what do you think is the objective of the mobilization? Oh, sorry, he's already said that. Millerand then says, okay, but don't you think the occupation of Serbia is a direct summons to you to wage war? To which Ignatieff replies, well, I can't answer this question, but I know that we have no desire for a European war, nor to take any steps that could provoke a European conflagration. To which Millerand then replies, he continues pressing, so, you plan to leave Serbia on her own. That, of course, is your business. But it should be understood that this is not on account of us. We are ready. My gotovi, says in Ignatieff's report to his line manager. Ignatieff reported that Millerand seemed perturbed and even annoyed by his non-committal responses. But he understood, or so he claimed, the thinking behind the French minister's position. And this is how he interpreted it. These declarations, he wrote to Zielinski, the chief of the Russian General Staff, these declarations can partly be explained by French fears that in the event of a French intervention, that is a French military intervention in the continental conflict, the Austrians, having crushed the Serbs, would quickly move all their forces against us, the Russians, and France would have to stand alone under the attack of the German armies. Now, there's surely something quite remarkable in this forcing of the pace by the French Minister of War. Millerand was a respected socialist politician and a stranger to foreign affairs, whose career had been mainly focused on issues like old age pensions, education, and the conditions of labor, rather than on geopolitical questions. He was presumably acting on instructions from his premier and foreign minister, Raymond Poincaré. By 1912, Millerand, a close friend of Poincaré, whom he'd known at school, they were both at the Lycée Louis-le-Grand, had become one of the leaders of the French national revival, the Réveil National. And his words, on the other hand, also reflected an attitude that was widespread within the French leadership during the Balkan winter crisis of 12-13. The deputy chief of the French General Staff, General Castelnau, spoke with Ignatieff a few days later in similar terms, telling the Russian attaché that he personally was, and I quote, ready for war, and even that he would like a war. These, of course, are Ignatieff's reports. This is not a report we have from Castelnau himself. Indeed, Ignatieff reported, the French government as a whole appears to be, and I quote, in full readiness to support us against Austria and Germany, not only by diplomatic means, but if need be, by force of arms. And the reason for this readiness lay, he believed, in French confidence that a Balkan war would produce the most advantageous starting point for a broader conflict, since it would oblige Germany to focus its military measures on Russia, and I quote again from Ignatieff, thereby leaving the French in the rear. The coordinating will behind this view of French security was, of course, Raymond Poincaré. During 1912, Poincaré, who was then both Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of France, extended the remit of the Franco-Russian alliance to cover the eventuality of a conflict that would ignite in the Balkans, in all likelihood between Austria and her neighbor, the Kingdom of Serbia. And one can trace these conversations between the French and the Russians right through the winter of 1912 into the early months of 1913. We have, for example, Izvolsky, the Russian ambassador, reporting that he just had a conversation with Poincaré in which he says, the French now at last accept that an attack by Austria-Hungary on Serbia might force Russia to give up its passive role. Should it be necessary for Russia to mount a military intervention against Austria-Hungary, and should this trigger an intervention by Germany, then, and I quote, the French government would recognize this in advance as a casus fideris and would not hesitate for one moment to fulfill the obligations which it has incurred in respect of Russia. And 6 weeks later, with the war well underway, the Balkan War well underway, this is towards the end of 1912, Izvolsky reported to Sazonov, the Russian foreign minister, and I quote, Poincaré is not afraid of the idea that it might prove necessary, and I quote, to initiate a war under certain circumstances, and that he was confident that the states of the Triple Entente would prevail. This confidence, Izvolsky added, was based on a detailed analysis of respective combat strengths by the French General Staff. Now, this was music, of course, to the ears of at least some Russian officials. As Ignatieff commented in his letter to Zielinski, it was important that the French interest in the Balkans be encouraged, because if one could foresee, and these are his words, a possibility of European war because of the Balkan events, then it is better for us in advance to encourage France to realize that our local conflict with Austria, because of the Turkish legacy, is the beginning of the solution of the Slavic-Germanic struggle in which France should connect its fate with the Slavic interest. And of course, we know that Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, also bought in a sort of oblique way into this reading of the future. His warnings in December 1812, it's not true, as is sometimes claimed, that Grey did not warn the Germans of the dangers of an intervention on behalf of Austria should there be a Balkan quarrel of this kind. He did warn them in December 1912 in words that show that he too had internalized the Balkan inception scenario. He said to Lichnowsky, the German ambassador in London, he said, don't assume that if something happens in the Balkans, and we don't care who starts the fight, it doesn't matter whether it's Serbia or Austria, a fight will break out, Russia may feel under pressure from her own public opinion to intervene, Germany will then come to Austria's support, France will come to Russia's support, don't assume that we will stay outside. We will fight on the side of France. He warned Lichnowsky in the clearest possible words of this, and so did Haldane. So there was a clear British warning which showed that Grey too had understood the logic of this extension of the security logic, if you like, the security logic of the Franco-Russian alliance. Though later, of course, as we know, during the July crisis, Grey would get very serious cold feet about the mechanism into which he had allowed himself to become implicated. And yet, of course, there was a problem with this policy. And that was that it in effect established Serbia as a salient of the Entente. This is only a partial picture, of course, and this is again the problem with having to cover in a very short time such a complex issue. In order to see how the Entente security policy became entangled with Serbia, we need to know a lot more, and I don't have time to go into this. We need to look at the history of French loans to Belgrade, at the reorientation of Russian Balkan policy away from Bulgaria towards Belgrade and Serbia, and at the violently Austrophobe Russian ambassador in Belgrade, Count Hartwig. But the key point is clear. By the spring of 1914, the powers of the Entente had allowed the Austro-Serbian frontier to become a kind of geopolitical tripwire. And this was an asymmetrical development because the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans had no corresponding geopolitical tripwire vis-a-vis the Russian Empire. There was no satellite state adjacent to Russia, which could perform for the Central Powers the kind of role that Serbia was beginning to perform for Russia and by extension for France. Now, here, a very important caveat. All of this was not the consequence of an overarching policy or a plan or a plot that steadily matured over time. There is no necessary or linear relationship whatsoever between the positions developed in 1912 and 1913 and the outbreak of war in the following year. It was not so much that the Balkan inception scenario, which was in effect a Serbian inception scenario, drove Europe towards the war that actually happened in 1914. It's rather the other way around, that it supplied the conceptual framework within which the crisis was interpreted, the Sarajevo crisis was interpreted once it had broken out. What had once been a highly speculative framing of future eventualities became, though only in response to the crisis triggered by the assassinations, a device for formulating or conceptualizing policy. And it's surely significant against this background that Poincaré, who became the first politician of the Third Republic to leap from the position of prime minister to the position of president, it's surely significant that Poincaré, now president of the Republic, used the opportunity of the state visit to St. Petersburg to renew the French promise of support for Russian firmness. His gospel, the gospel he preached in St. Petersburg, was the gospel of fermeté. Il faut tenir le coup. He said these words over and over again. Fermeté was the sort of recurring theme. And it's important to emphasize this because it's often been claimed in the literature that this visit to St. Petersburg between the 20th and the 23rd of July, since it had been planned long in advance, long before these assassinations occurred, was that the tone there was completely pacific and had nothing to do with the unfolding crisis. That's in fact not at all the case. Quite the contrary is the case, as we now know. As you can reconstruct in a lot of detail, though we don't have the protocols of the meetings, you can reconstruct in a lot of detail what was going on. And only in this context, in turn, can we make sense of Ignatieff's observation on the 30th of July, 1914, at the very end of the July crisis, as Europe is about to go to war, that he found among the senior militaries in Paris, his senior military colleagues, he knew many of them, he was on very good terms with the French military, that he found among his colleagues, and I quote, an unconcealed joy at having the chance to exploit, as the French think, beneficial strategic circumstances. Now, the key point to make here is that if we were reporting these words from Berlin, you'd all be falling asleep. I mean, some of you are anyway. But if we were reporting these words from Berlin, there would be a deep sense of whatever the opposite of surprise is, right? That's exactly the words we expect to hear from Berlin, because that is what is happening in Berlin. They're delighted that war is breaking out under, as Berlin sees it, beneficial strategic circumstances. The war, as Bethmann Holberg writes in his diary, or he doesn't, but Rietzler writes in his diary, the war must come from the East. And this is a war coming from the East. So the Germans are also getting, all their birthdays are coming at once as well. But the point is, you hear the same words, the same voices in other places as well, not just in Berlin. We hear exactly the same language, incidentally, in St. Petersburg as well. And in other words, acknowledging these pieces of causality, and they're nothing more than that, acknowledging these pieces of causality does not mean that we should minimize in any way the belligerence and the imperialist paranoia of the Austrian and the German policymakers, features of this pre-war setting that were themselves factors in the outbreak of war, and incredibly important ones, and have rightly absorbed the attention of Fritz Fischer, Emanuel Geist, John Röhl, and all of their historiographical allies. It does not mean that we should minimize the importance of the German promise to support Austria, come what may, on the 5th and 6th of July 1914, the famous blank check, a somewhat leading metaphor for the assurance of German support, unconditional German support, on the 5th and 6th of July 1914. After all, the Germans too, it turns out, had their own Balkan inception scenario, though they developed it somewhat later, as it were in response to the events at Sarajevo. Nor does all of this mean that we should blame Serbia or the Serbian government or Serbian statesmen for the outbreak of the First World War, which would, of course, be a ridiculous thing to do. I just say that because I occasionally get hate mail from Serbs. I'm endlessly having to explain this. But reflecting, on the other hand, on the Balkan dimension of Entente policy, does suggest, and this was an intelligent policy, I mean, it's very hard to fault Poincaré's on Balkan policy. Just excuse me. That's good. It's very hard to fault Poincaré's policy. It was an intelligent policy. There's no question. It was an intelligent policy, but a policy fraught, as we know in retrospect, with a certain risk. And reflecting on the Balkan dimension of Entente policy does, it seems to me, suggest that we need to think of the crisis that brought war in 1914 as authentically multipolar, multivectoral, and interactive. Framing the pre-war years in this way also alerts us, it seems to me, to the place of short-term realignments in the etiology of the First World War. For the most striking feature in this restructuring of Balkan geopolitics was how quickly it came about. This was not, a really long-term, it was not a phenomenon of the longue durée. It was not one of what Pierre Renouvin, in his magisterial work on the immediate causes of the war, it was not one of his forces profondes, which would have taken years to undo, which had matured over generations, but rather it was a short-term adjustment, a short-term realignment, rather, which confronted statesmen and politicians with the need to adjust in real time, very, very rapidly, to swift changes in the geopolitical environment. Given time, and it's amazing when you start looking for it, how many contemporaries testify to this, including Sazonov, the Russian foreign minister. Given time, the new Balkan constellation might just as quickly have made way for further adjustments and new systems. There's a very interesting moment when one of the Bulgarian delegates in St. Petersburg goes to see Sazonov and says, "This is terrible. You used to be our friends, and now you're in bed with the Serbs. What happened? I mean, the Serbs are terrible people. Haven't you not noticed that? You know, we Bulgarians are the old friends of the Russians. We're brother peoples. You know, what's going on?" And Sazonov said, relax, relax, relax. It's just, we're talking to Belgrade right now, but next year it'll all be different. Right? Now, it's amazing how many people are talking like this. These realignments are not etched into stone. They can go just as quickly as they come. What matters is, of course, that this particular pattern of alignments and commitments and scenarios was still in place in the summer of 1914 when the trigger of Sarajevo took place. So in other words, I hope this is already clear, this is not an attempt to do a Fisher on France. It is not revisionism in the sense of Harry Elmer Barnes, the interwar American apologist for the Germans, who was the special friend of the revisionist headquarters in the post-Versailles Berlin Foreign Office. This narrative is not supposed to displace the narrative of German responsibility. The relationship is additive and supplementary, not supersessional. The story, in other words, and here I want to close, of how this war came about is not a James Bond movie. This is not a story at the end of which we're going to find a coterie of velvet-jacketed villains stroking a black cat with a prosthetic hand in a kind of high-tech mountain hideaway with lots of buttons. It's not an Agatha Christie murder mystery, at the end of which we'll find the vicar standing with a blood-stained swordfish over the prone corpse of Lady Carrington in the conservatory. The crises that brought this war to Europe and to the world were genuinely multipolar and interactive. Their complexity has to be taken seriously. It was a major factor in the way that decision-making unfolded during the crisis, because this is a crisis where everybody had a very limited understanding of what was going on. They had very clear objectives, but very limited understanding of the complexity of what was unfolding amongst all the different alliance partners. The levels of trust and understanding within alliances were almost as low as the levels of trust and understanding between them. The war, these crises were made up of long and tangled chains of decisions embedded within and expressive of structures that were themselves soft and in flux, constantly changing. There were decisions taken by a gallery of actors who were grounded in a fundamentally similar European political culture. I thank you.
Make sure I'm wired for sound. Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Chris. That was a very provocative, very interesting lecture. And we have microphones at each side of the room for those who'd like to ask questions. And if you feel you'd like to ask a question, please move to the microphone now. Don't all rush. I'll perhaps begin with a slightly tendentious question. Clearly, I think there's an awful lot to your thesis about shared responsibility and the fact that this Balkan inception moment is something that's shared in Berlin as much as it is in Paris or St. Petersburg. If we fast forward, though, into the 1920s, I'm wondering what your reaction is to the theses of Holger Herwig, who argues that the German Foreign Office, the Auswärtiges Amt, actively tried to manipulate, to shape, and to deceive international public opinion, international historical opinion, precisely on the question of German war guilt in the First World War and on the question of the origins of the war. So I'm wondering what your reaction to Herwig would be.
Well, the answer is an emphatic yes. They most certainly did try to manipulate the record. And they wanted to manipulate the record in support of a completely untenable and ridiculous thesis, which you could only describe as sort of German innocentism, that the Germans were just sort of peacefully minding their own business, and then they were leapt upon by Russia and France. A grotesque kind of misimagining of what had taken place. And of course, those efforts only make sense if one understands the fraught emotional environment created by the end of the war, by defeat, political instability, revisionism, the Versailles Treaty, the Schmach paragraph, the reference to German. The term war guilt is not actually used in the Versailles Treaty,
No.
but it was in other documents sort of flanking it. But the taint of responsibility, sole responsibility of the war, implied by that document. So, yes, they did manipulate the record, but of course manipulations took place in other places as well. I mean, there's a certain amount of manipulation in Paris as well. And Barthou makes it quite clear that this is a political project, and we're not doing this big documentary edition of the French documents just so that historians can understand the past better. It is, as he puts it, a political project. So the Russians are a kind of odd man out there, odd person out there, because the Russian source edition, which is a fascinating monument to the Russian sort of post-revolutionary scholarship of the era, had exactly the opposite intention, namely to impugn Russian foreign policy as imperialist and as deeply implicated in the war. So they're actually doing quite the opposite. They depict the Russians as predatory imperialist powers, manipulating the Balkans in very dangerous ways and so on. So politics is distorting the picture right across the scene, and you have things like we know that that the Poincaré was very upset by the publication of Paléologue's memoirs. I mean, Paléologue himself massaged the record in all sorts of ways, but Paléologue was very proud of the role that he'd played in helping to bring helping to get things going in St. Petersburg, and that of course deeply annoyed Poincaré, who felt that Paléologue had and also created the grounds for a myth, which was that Paléologue was acting independently of Poincaré's instructions in St. Petersburg, for which there is not the slightest shred of evidence. So, there's manipulation going on all sides to some extent. There are changes to the dates, and of course this applies also to the colored books published during the war itself. But and the Germans stand out there, but there are ways of working around that. Obviously, one of the great benefits, pieces of good fortune, in having the Fischer, not just Fischer, but the squad of really high caliber historians who engaged in in picking through the German materials again, disregarding the official publications and going through the archives. They of course have done a great deal to correct the misrepresentations in the initial the Große Politik der Europäischen Kabinette, which is which is 40-something volumes, a massive sort of convolute. But yes, they're all slanted in a sort of revisionist direction on behalf of the particular state in question.
Okay, what I think I'd like to do is have people at the microphones beginning over here. Introduce yourself so that Professor Clark knows who you are, and then ask your question.
I'm Jeremy Popkin, a specialist on a completely different era. But as I was listening to you, it seemed that all the evidence you cited about French intentions came from Russian sources.
Yeah.
And I can understand that the Russians had a desire to believe that the French were going to back them up in this. I'm sort of wondering, what about the French sources? Has 100 years of research not given us a better picture than we had, say, in the 1920s of what French intentions really were? Are we that dependent on Russian sources that might possibly be hearing what they wanted to hear from
yes, that is of course a danger, especially with Izvolsky, who was kind of a blowhard who tended to talk up his own importance and tended to pack content into the conversations he had with his French interlocutors. So that's always a danger when you're dealing with foreign envoy reports of that kind. But there are French sources which corroborate, and you can, as it were, check these against the control of French sources, in particular on Poincaré's reorientation in Balkan policy. For example, I just didn't want to cite them because the Ignatieff record of the conversation with Mitterrand as such rich material. I mean, of course, it's conceivable, I suppose, that Ignatieff simply made it up, but there's no reason to suppose that was the case. He was regarded as a very sound and accurate reporter on events in Paris. And Izvolsky is another question, but Ignatieff was seen as very reliable. But you have also the Cambon letters. Also, the Cambons had good contacts with Poincaré and often spoke with him. And there are very interesting exchanges between Jules and Paul Cambon about in which they express their worries about the way in which Poincaré is stiffening his commitment over the Balkans and getting France locked into positions which they see as unnecessary. And they speak of his raideur, the stiffness of a man of law, as they see it, a man with a legal training who's prone, once he's made a commitment, just simply to stay with it. So there's lots of other corroborating references to what goes on. It's not utterly mysterious on the French side either.
My name's Patrick Holditch. I'm the British Consul General here in Montreal, and unintentionally arrived a bit late. I apologise. It wasn't some sort of symbolism of the Brits arriving late for the Orient. So
was that like British entry into the war?
Well, exactly. We did make it. But I also used to play around as a historian many years ago. Can I ask a question? Because I can't ask a question contemporaneously on intelligence. But let me ask you historically. One of your theses is very much the lack of full information, unclear picture which decision makers were working. But from reading your book and for reading a bit more of the research done in recent years, it seems the intelligence picture which existed wasn't that bad necessarily at the time. And although intelligence failure becomes an issue in the analysis of later wars, I'm thinking of Pearl Harbor, Barbarossa, and parts of the Cold War, at the time, although clearly it's not modern intelligence analysis, each side seemed to have a pretty good idea of the other's intentions. I just wonder if you could sort of comment on that and develop that a bit.
Well, first, let me answer that at two levels. The first is that one thing you notice, and this applies to all the centers of all the executive decision-making centers before 1914, is a kind of perennial and ambient confusion about who was responsible for making foreign policy. And this doesn't just apply to France, it applies to Britain. I mean, there's the problem that Edward Grey can't speak for his cabinet because his view of foreign policy is not shared by the majority of the members of the British cabinet, certainly not shared by his own party, the Liberal Party, or by the majority of members of Parliament. So it's a secretive policy that has to be presented in public in a way that will appease opponents of the policy in the cabinet, and that creates constant confusion about who's making what policy in Britain. But the same thing applies in Russia. So there's, and if you ask someone, a well-informed local legation secretary or something, who's running the show in Russia, the answer will always be different from one month and week to the next, because power is moving around in this sort of hive-like structure from one node to another. So there's perennial confusion about where policy is coming from and what form it's going to take and how decisions will pan out, even in the quite near future. And intelligence isn't really very helpful about that. Where intelligence comes in, because you actually have good intelligence, you've got people who know these people and talking to them, the constant flow of dispatches. You've got, which are fat with newspaper files, where people concentrate not just on public opinion, but on pieces that they think may have been inspired by particular ministers. So it's about finding in the press the keys to what the government is thinking. There's a lot of that going on, and the intelligence is quite good on that, but nevertheless, what the intelligence is providing an accurate picture of is a situation which is in itself rather complex and unresolved. As for the question of military intelligence, which I take to be the core of what you were asking about, yes, you're quite right. It's very high quality. I mean, the best case is Russia, which has, thanks to the capturing of Oberst Redl, he was sort of caught in a kind of honey trap by Russian intelligence, which was operated one of the most sophisticated, code-breaking and human, as they now call it, human intelligence operations in Europe. They captured him. He was homosexual, and they captured him through a sort of honey trap, and then paid him for all sorts of things. And in the course of which they got hold of virtually the entire Austrian mobilization schedule of 1913. So they knew exactly what the Austrians were planning to do. They had really high-quality intelligence. On the other hand, how useful was that really in 1914? when the situation actually happens in the Balkans in 1914, and Bruce Menning has written about this, the good quality intelligence that the Russians have encouraged them to misread. They misunderstand Austrian behavior, and in particular the movement of Austrian units, because they think the Austrians are still running in conformity with the 1913 plan, whereas what the Austrians have in fact done is slightly adjusted their plan because they've revised upwards their estimates of the troop strengths that will be needed to counter Serbia. So the Russians misread what the Austrians are doing because they understand too well what they had been planning to do in 1913. I hope that makes sense. But it's the danger of high quality, highly texted intelligence can entrap the people who are trying to interpret it, as well as give them, sort of breadth of vision. But by and large, yes, in terms of what each of the states is planning to do militarily, the so-called Schlieffen Plan is well understood in France. There's been part of the plans found in a document folder that's left on a train. I mean, it's the usual story. We're still having these stories today. And there's a certain amount of other forms of successful military intelligence, and any intelligent military observer of the scene in 1914 knows that the Germans are going to try to come in through Belgium. And we know that also in British cabinet they said, they're not going to come through the Place Forte of Belfort and Verdun and so on. They'll go through south of the Sambre and Meuse. Everybody assumed that. So I suppose that would be my answer to your question about intelligence. Monsieur,
One question up here at the microphone.
but let's, I can repeat the question if Monsieur Paul.
Okay.
Je peux répéter la question si oui.
Oui, bon, j'apprécie beaucoup votre livre qui m'a appris énormément, notamment sur les rapports entre l'Autriche et la Serbie et plus généralement les Balkans. De même, la manière dont vous venez de donner une démonstration dont vous faites jouer ensemble la complexité des acteurs. Ce n'est pas des acteurs isolés, la prise de décision, ce n'est pas un chef, et le côté multilatéral. Bon. Je trouve cependant que votre livre minimise un peu la politique allemande, et la réception qu'il reçoit me semble confirmer l'interprétation qui est faite, c'est que Fischer avait tort. Or, je ne suis pas un spécialiste d'histoire diplomatique, je ne lis pas tous les livres qui paraissent sur les origines de la guerre de 14, mais je lis les livres importants comme le vôtre, et j'ai lu celui de Fischer. Je conserve de Fischer non seulement l'idée d'un soutien des Allemands à l'Autriche, mais l'idée d'encouragement et même d'une certaine crainte de la part des Allemands que les Autrichiens ne se dégonflent.
Oui.
Alors peut-être que Fischer a tort, mais je suis surpris que vous n'ayez pas vraiment réfuté cette
Oui, ok.
Dans Fischer, il y a à prendre et à laisser. L'interprétation que Fischer, l'importance que Fischer donne au plan Bettmann-Olweg du 9 septembre me paraît démesurée. Ou en tout cas excessive. Mais cette partie de la...
Oui, je comprends. OK, can I... Oh oui. OK, this is going to be difficult to try to remember this. Yeah, go on.
Je suis comme Guillaume frappé de la passivité de la France. Dans le récit de la July Crisis, il y a des acteurs qui se manifestent, les Allemands, les Autrichiens, les Serbes, les Russes, les Anglais. Les Français sont comme aux abonnés absents.
Et ils sont comment, semble?
Aux abonnés absents.
Aux abonnés absents, OK. Oui, je comprends. Oui. Absent subscribers, oui. Abonnés absents, c'est a nice picture. Yeah.
Il me semble qu'il y a deux raisons à cette passivité française. La première, c'est que la position française est parfaitement connue depuis le début et qu'elle ne changera pas. Nous sommes trop faibles face aux Allemands, il faut que nous soyons soutenus par les Russes.
Exactly.
Donc nous ferons ce que les Russes nous demanderont de faire.
Yeah.
C'est parfaitement clair, donc ce n'est pas la peine de le redire, tout le monde le sait. Il y a une deuxième raison, c'est que la France a été contrainte à la passivité pendant une période cruciale, qui est celle de l'ultimatum de l'Autriche à la Serbie, qui est un ultimatum qui dure 48 heures, et pour les Autrichiens, il est tout à fait essentiel que cet ultimatum court pendant que les Français, Poincaré et son président du Conseil, Viviani, sont en mer, de façon à ce qu'ils ne puissent pas intervenir. Et c'est tellement important pour les Autrichiens qu'ils retardent d'une heure la remise de l'ultimatum. L'ultimatum, vous le racontez d'ailleurs très bien, il est sur la table de l'ambassadeur autrichien à Belgrade et on lui téléphone pour lui dire non, non, attendez une heure de plus.
Oui.
Donc c'est une question qui a de l'importance pour l'Autriche. Je ne comprends pas, et ça c'est ma question.
La première question.
La deuxième est sans intérêt, je peux vous la poser après.
Ok, oui.
Ouais, intéressant. Mais pourquoi les Autrichiens tenaient-ils tellement à ce que les Français ne soient pas joignables pendant que l'ultimatum courait? Est-ce qu'ils avaient peur?
Est-ce que vous pourriez répéter cette partie de la question? Pourquoi les Autrichiens
voulaient absolument que les Français ne puissent pas être actifs pendant que l'ultimatum courait? Car les deux interprétations sont possibles. Ils pouvaient craindre, s'ils avaient envie de faire la guerre, ils pouvaient craindre que la France ne donne des conseils de modération. Et si au contraire, ils ne voulaient pas la guerre, ils pouvaient craindre que les Français n'incitent les Serbes à protester. Et malgré tout, la réponse des Serbes à l'ultimatum a été considérée dans un premier temps par l'ensemble des partenaires diplomatiques comme une grande victoire pour l'Autriche. Vous analysez très bien, c'est une remarquable explication de texte, les sous-entendus de la réponse à l'ultimatum. Mais ma question sur quel est le sens de l'insistance.
Oui. Ok.
Tout à fait minime. L'ultimatum du 2 août des Allemands aux Français, nous acceptons que vous restiez neutre, mais il faut que vous mettiez en gage tous les Verdun à nos gardes.
Oui.
Quel est le sens de cet ultimatum lancé le 2 août, au moment même où il lance l'ultimatum à la Belgique pour demander le libre passage?
Libre passage. Can you summarize those two questions?
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, let me begin by emphasizing that Antoine Pro said he appreciates my book. that was it, really. That was it. Okay. So first of all, he said, and I'm very grateful to that because, of course, I also appreciate. I mean, I've been admiring and reading Antoine's books for many, many years. But the first point he makes is, do I not minimize I'm going to really reduce this down. Do I not minimize the role of German aggression? What's left of the Fischer thesis? Am I not, because I don't seem to directly to refute Fischer, have I not simply minimized the place of German aggression? Then there was a second point. Surely France does appear very passive in the decisive phase of the July crisis. And then there's the question of why the I'm finding it difficult to read my own words, why the Austrians insist on issuing the ultimatum when the French leadership is at sea, as it were, delaying it, in other words, to allow Poincaré to leave before the ultimatum is issued. So let me deal with those questions that's just picking a few points from what you said. But let me deal with those three questions just very briefly. The first question is, I don't refute Fischer in the book because I don't think I can. I don't think Fischer can be refuted. I mean, he didn't make up his sources. It's an extraordinary monument, Fischer's monument, Fischer's archival scholarship. And, I think the question is, what can Fischer show and what can't he show? What he can show is a sort of mindset, a mentality. in the French leadership, and he does that with great effect. And I think it's in that area that we can discern the kind of continuities he argued for between 1914 and later developments in the Third Reich and so on, in certain parts of the German political culture, certain parts of it. But, you know, when I had finished writing this book, I read it through myself, and I thought, goodness, I was a bit shocked by how the Germans had sort of, you know, ceased to dominate the scene in the way in which they had in most of... See, I was brought up at school in Australia by teachers who were all disciples of Fischer. So I remember one teacher telling us, boys, if you get a question on the outbreak of the First World War, just remember the 5 German provocations. And he said, ships, because they built ships, you should never build ships, the British don't like that. They went into Morocco, they provoked the French, you should never provoke the French in Africa. They really don't like that. They supported the Austrians in annexing Bosnia-Herzegovina, you shouldn't do that because the Russians don't like that. They provoked the French again in Morocco, and then they gave the blank check. So that's that was the 5 points with which to explain the outbreak of the First World War. So, and suddenly I'd done this book, and there was sort of very little left of all of that. And I thought, have I gone too far? So then I went back, actually, and I read my way again. I reread my own notes, and I went back to the books, the Fischer school books, and including Fischer. And I looked for, in Krieg der Illusionen, for example, I looked for actual concrete examples of German misbehavior. Where did the Germans destabilize the international setting? And it's amazing how little there is in Fischer, how little there is in the way of practical analysis of interstate interactions. It's not really, Fischer's not really about that. So that, I suppose, I don't want to refute Fischer because I think all that aggressivity is there. I think the argument for the preventive war that Fischer took very seriously is also part of the story. I tried to integrate that into the analysis. And so you have, you know, Moltke saying, obviously repeatedly, Dieter Hoffmann has brought out a book about a year ago called Der Sprung ins Dunkle, The Leap into the Dark, where he says that there are over 30 occasions on which senior policymakers in Berlin press for a war sooner rather than later, and they often are thinking of a preventive war. So there's no question that is there. But then the question is, how does it feed into what the Germans are actually doing during the July crisis? And it seemed to me that it was not bringing about a preventive war never became German policy. What I think was German policy was to establish whether this is in the reasoning of the German policymakers, Bethmann, was to establish whether the Russians wanted a war. And if the Russians wanted a war over Serbia, then Bethmann's position was, we'd rather have the war now than later. Let's do this now rather than later. Now that already is a very, very dangerous viewpoint to take in this extremely inflamed situation. And with that viewpoint, by taking that line, Bethmann Hollweg makes himself responsible in very large part, in a very important part, for the outbreak of this war. But it's not the same as saying that Germany plans and then triggers and launches a preventive war. Now, you mentioned in connection with that an argument which has often been made by the Fischer School, which is that the Germans actually goad the Austrians, they're pressing the Austrians into this attack on Serbia because they're trying to use it as a pretext. But actually what happens is slightly different from that, it seems to me. The Austrians at first are not sure what they're going to do. Then they make up their mind. It doesn't take very long. It takes about 24 hours. And there's a consensus in Vienna. Everybody except the Hungarian Minister-President, Tisza, wants a war against Serbia. There's no dissenting voice, virtually. And then the question is, will they actually do it? And will they do it soon? And that's when the Germans get nervous. And you have lots of conversations where they're saying, well, we admire your, the bravado, right, of this plan, but are you actually going to follow through? Because that was really the worry with the Austrians, that they would talk big, but then nothing would happen, or when it did happen, it would go off half-cocked and so on, or that it would take so long that the support for Austria would evaporate internationally. So the Germans do then start putting on the pressure and saying, when are you going to do something? We're still waiting. When's it going to happen? And so on. That's not the same as saying that the Germans actually try to use this as a pretext. Coming back to then there's a question of why the Austrians think it's so important that the French should be at sea. Well, the reason for that is the Austrians have completely misunderstood the situation. The Austrians tried to keep the terms of their ultimatum secret. In fact, like most efforts to keep anything secret in Austria, this was a failure. And secrecy was not something that the Habsburgs were good at. And in fact, the so-called secret was leaked very, very early. And exactly that happened which the Austrians were trying to prevent by waiting until Poincaré's departure. Namely, the French and the Russians and the Serbs, everybody had a chance to chat and talk about what they would do in the event of the presentation of this ultimatum. We have, as early as the 16th of July, a letter from Shebekor, the Russian ambassador in Vienna, explaining to Sazonov, and he passes it to the Tsar, exactly what the Austrians are going to demand. It's almost word for word. He says they will demand that Austrian officials take part in the committee which closes down these irredentist networks. This will not be, reconcilable, in my view, with Serbian sovereignty. And the Tsar, of course, adds a marginal comment to this. He says, any state which makes demands against another state must be planning war. So, in other words, there is no surprise effect. The Austrians completely muck that up. But the reason they wait for the departure of Poincaré is because they were hoping to achieve a surprise and not to allow the French and the Russians to communicate with each other about what was going on. Now, you're right about it. I think it's not wrong what you say about the passivity of France. France is passive. It's rather like, there's a sort of odd mirroring logic to this. The war is going to begin aggressively in the east with the Russians, in the sense the Russians, start pre-mobilization measures quite early, and the French sanction those, and French support is a crucial part of Russian reasoning. So, we know that from the discussions of the Council of Ministers. They say, Sukhomlinov says, before, when we were considering mobilizing, we didn't know if the French would support us. Today, it's a different story. We know from Monsieur Paléologue and before him, Monsieur Delcassé, we will have full French support for whatever we're doing. That's part of the reasoning. On the other hand, the French themselves must remain virtually motionless, inert, in order not to alienate the British. And there's a lot of worrying going on in Paris about how you manage a war which is going to start aggressively in the east, but has to start defensively in the west. It's a very complex triangulation. And because of as you say, you're right, all of this is not a function of French strength and aggression. It's a function of French fear and weakness vis-a-vis the much larger army of Germany. And the British Expeditionary Force and British participation above all in the war is, of course, as you know very, very well, absolutely essential, and Poincaré sees that as almost as important as the alliance with Russia. So it's all got to be managed very, very carefully, and that's why you have this sort of, the zone where the men are held back. It's not quite a demilitarized zone, but the couverture is pulled back slightly, and that explains, I think, to some extent, the passivity of French policy. There's one very interesting moment where you had, I think, the 30th of July, when it becomes clear the Russians are mobilizing, and they've issued an order of general mobilization. The Germans have warned that if the Russians don't rescind this order, they will counter-mobilize and in due course declare war. And at this point, the French send a telegram to St. Petersburg. Poincaré sends a telegram to St. Petersburg saying, don't do anything to provoke the Germans. Be careful not to provoke the Germans. And a copy of this telegram is immediately sent simultaneously to London, so that Britain will know France is not escalating the crisis. But at the same time, he informs Izvolsky, and there are conversations with Ignatieff and Izvolsky, both of them, they corroborate each other, in which they say France should continue to mobilize, Russia should continue to mobilize. In fact, it should accelerate its mobilization, but not concentrate on the frontier. So, mobiliser, mais ne pas concentrer. So, in other words, the French, I think, are in a very difficult position. They've got to manage an incredibly complexly triangulated alliance policy. And that, I think, explains the appearance of passivity to some extent. I'm not suggesting by this means that the French are single-handedly escalating the crisis. The Germans have already escalated it. But they are reacting in a proactive way to the new challenges posed. You said other things too, and I hope we can talk about this later. But that by way of a sort of first response.
All right.
Time for two questions, one from the microphone and then one from John Horn here in the front row.
I think my question will be slightly briefer than the previous one, slightly.
But it was a good question.
So thanks for this talk. There seems to be a really interesting tension between your emphasis on agency and actions on the one hand, but then on the other hand, the sort of, I think, passive language that we all tend to use when talking about the war, right? The war broke out. The first shot was fired, and so on and so forth. And the same tension also applies to this kind of language of inevitability, right?
Yeah.
Once you have the sort of the war in the Balkans, and it's a European war, then it's a world war. But so maybe this is kind of an innocent and concrete way to put the question: how do we account for before there's a world war, before it's a European war, we have this German-French war, right? And it seems to me that what's missing is the German attack, right? The German attack on France via Belgium. So if we look at it not from sort of the background and the origins, and then sort of the inevitability of the alliance system kicking in, there still is this action that seems to me fundamental and a real turning point, at least in that phase, that part of talking about the war, that I'd like to hear kind of an account for. Because yes, the French played rough and talked tough. All the imperial European powers did that, but this seems to me a unique event, right?
Well, I wouldn't want to downplay the importance of the breach of Belgian neutrality, or of the appalling violence that followed in Belgium, the atrocities and so on. I think we mustn't forget that, and I don't mean this in a sort of cheap point-scoring way, but the first two major skirmishes, or first two major armed conflicts that take place between great powers in 1914, between great powers, and I'm not counting now the breach of Luxembourg, we mustn't forget Luxembourg, which is also overrun, and southern Belgium, but also confining the view now to skirmishes or armed exchanges between great powers. They both take place on German territory. That shouldn't be forgotten. Russian units enter East Prussia very, very swiftly, and the war begins inside German territory. There are French units in Alsace. Now, of course, these are the Provinces Perdues, and they have a special status. But nevertheless, that occurs before there are any German units on French soil. So, the Germans, by breaching Belgian neutrality, they clearly make a very important contribution to the outbreak of this conflict. There's no question of that. But that doesn't mean that they are, as it were, acting alone in an otherwise peaceful continent. So that would be part of my answer to what you say. But you also made an interesting point about narratives of inevitability. I was wondering, how did you want to connect that to this? You're saying shouldn't we put agency back in? And if we put agency back in, what happens to acts like this?
Right.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that the point about the war in the West is that the war in the West had to begin that way. The war in the East began with a Russian mobilization and Russian invasion of East and East Prussia. In the West, it began with Germany's invasion of Belgium and France. There's no question that's true. But why would you say that one is crucial and defining importance, whereas the other is not?
Well, just in terms of the conflict between Germany and France, the direct conflict between Germany and France, where the inevitability seems to me in talking about, well, once we have a war with Russia, then it's inevitable that but it still takes an act of agency for the Germans to then attack Belgium and France.
Yes, well, I mean, the Germans do try. I mean, in order to respond to that, really, one needs to kind of go into the micropolitics, which I won't, but the sort of maneuvering that goes on in the last few days of the July crisis. But, the Germans do ask Edward Grey. I mean, Lichnowsky asks Edward Grey. He actually hasn't been briefed to do this, but he asks Edward Grey unexpectedly. He says, well, you seem very worried that we might invade Belgium. But what happens if we don't? Is that going to be okay? Will you then promise to remain neutral? And Edward Grey says, I'm sorry, I'm not authorized to comment on that. So the Germans don't have any assurance that, as it were, there's no grounds for the Germans to be confident that if they abstain from attacking, they will not themselves be attacked. And then onto that you have to, and of course the wording of the ultimatum, which you can see is ruthless and cruel, and it is, all ultimata are like that. The ultimatum to Paris, which says, what are you planning to do? There's a war breaking out now in the East. If you remain neutral, you want Verdun, this kind of thing. And the French reply is, France will comport herself in accordance with their interests, which is a very splendid reply. But I mean, the point is that the Germans have no reason to think that they won't be attacked if they don't themselves attack. And into that feeds what Louis Snyder once called the cult of the offensive. The idea that you must preempt the enemy, you must take the battle to the enemy before the enemy brings the battle to you. This is a sort of gospel shared by all the military commanders of that era. They're all thinking of the offensive. And so the Germans then, I mean, that helps to explain why things pan out as they do. Of course, this offensive concept only applies in the West, where the bulk of German forces are. It doesn't apply in the East, where you have a mere holding force. As we know, things didn't quite turn out that way. The holding force proved capable of breaking the first Russian onslaught. And this, incidentally, is an extraordinary part of the story of how 1914 came about. It was made possible in part by a grotesque overestimation of Russian power and capability. So that would be my answer to your interesting question. Thank you.
One final question from tomorrow afternoon's plenary speaker, Professor John Horn from Trinity College Dublin.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Clark, for a paper which was as brilliant and brilliantly delivered as the book itself, and obviously full of wonderful points. Just a very quick comment, and then my question. I mean, the comment is that I'm fascinated by, in a way, how the distinction you draw between the how and the why, between the agency, the individual responsibilities, and the structures, goes back to the crisis itself. The socialists at the time are talking structures and saying it's all to do with imperialism.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the chancellors of Europe are all talking about the how, which is who did it. And
Yeah.
I think actually the how is closer to the guilt question, because we don't pose it in those terms anymore and shouldn't, but it is the question of individual responsibilities. And I think in a way by shifting the balance back, you've done a wonderful service, because you've brought out these two fundamentally different ways of thinking about international relations, and we need both of them. I mean, we both need to think about deep structures and processes, because the individual agency doesn't make sense without that.
Absolutely.
But in our own collective political lives, actually, we call our politicians to account for their agency, what they do and don't do, and what the causes are. And in a sense, the how question is feeding that back into history. And I think it's a wonderful rectifying, if you like, of our balance of interpretation. But you use the
I knew there was a but coming.
Wouldn't be a question without it.
Exactly.
But you use the idea of a node, which I think is a really interesting one. And my question is how far you would want to develop that and conceptually make use of it. Your node, granted, all you say about the multilaterality, the multiple options existing for each power and so on, but you nonetheless suggest that at certain points, power decision-making clusters around a node, I mean, a knotty problem, if you like. And at another point in your paper, you use the term scenario. And I wonder if node and scenario don't give one a connecting point between the more structural elements and the more agency-driven individual decision dimension to what it is that you're saying. And if we just for a moment think that through from the French case, then what are the scenarios of Poincaré and other key actors in the French case? It would seem to me that one of the crucial aspects is that when they're thinking about Russia and security tied to Russia, shifting balance of power in the Balkans, they're always thinking about Germany.
Always, yeah.
We spoke earlier in the day and made the point that, like the French during the period of the Revolution, the Germans in the early 20th century have multiple potential enemies because they're potentially hegemonic in Europe. France is a relatively weak power now.
It is.
The only enemy which counts is Germany. That being the case, if in 1912, during the First Balkan War, and even during the Second Balkan War, and again in the July crisis 1914, Germany is to the fore in the minds of Poincaré and the other key French actors, then are there certain comparisons, are there certain, let's say, two scenarios which in a different form we find being replayed in the autumn of 1912 and then in the July crisis 1914? And might one sum it up this way, that in a curious way what shifted in the autumn of 1912 is that the balance of power by the great powers in Europe has lost control of the balance of power in the Balkans. In a way, things are now out of control. In a way, the system as understood is beginning to unravel. Yeah. And in a position in which, therefore, France is dependent for its security on Russia, but Germany also, in a curious way, despite its power, sees itself as dependent upon its junior ally, Austria-Hungary, for its power and projection into southeastern Europe, both, in a sense, have a problem. And that the net effect of the two Balkan wars, which creates, first of all, a powerful Bulgaria, and then in particular, a powerful Serbia, is that it means that the decline in Ottoman power is being replaced locally by a balance of power dependent upon emerging nation states and often a quite rabid nationalism.
Yeah.
And in that scenario, the Austrians naturally want to step in and replace the Turks and reconfigure imperial dynastic power. And the Russians, curiously, despite all they have to fear from nationalism, want to do the reverse.
Yeah.
And in some way, even though they prefer Bulgaria to Serbia, as you show, nonetheless, those Balkan powers, their independence, are, as it were, the forward projection of Russian power, and therefore French security is tied into that. So what we have actually in the autumn of 1912 is a situation in which the local balance of power has changed, and Austria-Hungary has now been wrong-footed, and Germany with it. So the sense of crisis you describe, I seem to recall, and that I think is one thing Fischer does present very well. He draws the wrong conclusions from that December crisis in Germany. He says the Kaiser...
December 1912, yeah.
December 1912, is it es geht den Sein oder Nichtsein Deutschlands. It's a matter of the survival or the destruction of Germany through what happens to Austria-Hungary. And in a curious sense, it's the same for the French. So perhaps the passivity of the French, as Antoine Pau expressed it, is that in 1912, 1913, and again in 1914, in a sense, the French have events on their side. The only thing that can go wrong is if the Austro-Hungarians decide to reconfigure power, which means taking out Serbia. And they don't do it, they're restrained from doing it in 1912, 1913. And it seems to me that at heart, the key to the July crisis is a very simple one. The Austro-Hungarians, and the Germans have backed them up, say from the start they're going to take out Serbia. Whether they do it militarily or diplomatically is to be decided, largely by Serbian reactions. And of course, the huge danger is whether or not it will lead to a European war. But in that sense, that would explain the kind of reactivity. And what we're seeing, therefore, in terms of the multilaterality that you describe, is in fact this insistent scenario coming through with stronger power, which is about a shift of the balance of power in the Balkans. If you wanted a second question, it would simply be this.
I'm struggling to manage with that one, but go on.
What do contemporary, in having read so many of the sources, how do contemporaries, and here I'm picking up on James Joel's wonderful notion of the unspoken assumptions, what do people mean by war in 1914?
Okay.
We talk so much about origins and causes, but what did they mean by war, which allowed them to make those calculated decisions?
Well, thank you very much for that. I mean, let me say I don't disagree with anything you've just said. I think that that's an incredibly astute analysis of how the Balkan problematic fits into the larger dynamics of the international system. And in fact, it would have been good if you could have said that before I finished writing the book. I could have refined the conclusion. I think that, if we think now about French scenarios, this is very, very interesting. On the one hand, I want to come back to a point I just made in reply to the previous speaker, that, the really big news in 12, 13, 14 is that Russia is back on the scene. I mean, the Russo-Japanese War, this isn't something that happens again and again in Russian history. The Russians get beat really badly, and everybody says, well, that's them. We won't be hearing from them anymore. And then a short while later, suddenly they're back again. And this is exactly what happened in 12, 13, 14. And of course, as we know, these massive French loans to Russia, which take a while to contract and to organize legally and so on. Del Casse plays a very important role in that, helped to accelerate this process. But what you have in addition to the real re-emergence of Russia as a major regional power in the Balkans, manipulating, riding the tiger of Balkan instability, deliberately encouraging it, by setting up various leagues and so on against the Ottomans. It's just a new version of their old anti-Ottoman policy. In addition to that, you have this speculative bubble around Russia, the almost universal belief that Russia is about to explode into... there's a man called Verneuil, who was the syndic of the Parisian Bourse, who's sent by the Parisian Stock Exchange, who's sent by Poincaré on a sort of fact-finding mission to St. Petersburg. And he writes this fascinating letter where he says, this country is about to go through the kind of revolutionary expansion of productivity and power that we saw in the United States after the Civil War. This is the America of the future. I cannot find words strong enough to tell you what is going on here. It's just everywhere I look. But you look at the British military attachés, they say the Russian army is a completely different creature from what it was when they performed so badly against the Japanese. I've never seen such efficient maneuvering. I've never seen such determined soldiering. There's a sort of, we all know from the media today how the media can talk themselves into something, right? Celtic tiger economies and, all sorts of booms and so on that are predicted. The mints now, it used to be the bricks and so on. Well, there's a kind of speculative rhetorical bubble around Russia. Now, what does that mean for France? It means, on the one hand, well, you have an ally which is about to be the most powerful, have the largest army ever known in human history. That's got to be good news. On the other hand, there's a lot of anxiety in Paris that as Russia becomes more and more powerful, although it's, this is being achieved in part with French cash, as Russia becomes more and more powerful, it will need France less and less. So in other words, there are different scenarios operating in tandem with each other, and they have an unstable relationship with each other. The scenario that Russia will be there to take our chestnuts out of the fire is one thing, but on the other hand, the worry that the Russians in a couple of years may not be there anymore is another thing, and that enhances the willingness to take risks in the short term. I think that the work by Gerd Kummeich, his wonderful study of French armaments policy, makes this point actually that Poincaré is under a lot of pressure. Time pressure as well, because he thinks the cards he has in his hand right now, the 3 years law, a government which is more or less willing to support his foreign policy and Russian support, are short-term assets, which he may not have in 18 months' time. And so he's under a lot of pressure, but he's not the only one. I mean, all across Europe we see this. So that would be so much on the question of scenarios. On the issue of structures and action, that's, I think, one of the deepest mysteries of our whole profession, how one relates those things. And all I would say is that it seems to me that events and action are not, on the one hand, a soft and malleable foam-like substance, as Bourdelle famously put it in such a beautiful metaphor of the waves of history with the little foam bubbles on the top, which they carry on their strong backs, he called them, their strong backs. It's not that the events are little tiny bubbles and soft and malleable, whereas the forces are like steel girders, like the laws of physics. On the contrary, the structures are themselves soft. They're like overboiled spaghetti. They're constantly moving and recoupling with each other and changing. I've never encountered a hard structure. Whenever I meet a structure, it always turns out that it's changing and mutating all the time. So it seems to me events can be hard and structures can be soft. It doesn't have to be that that we don't have to separate them in a kind of binary way. And then finally, the question of you raised lots of different points, but another one, and I'm just going to stop with this one. Surely you suggest the intention to take out Serbia is the key, right? Now, one state is going to be invaded. That's how the war starts. I mean, this would be a counter-argument you could make to what I've been saying. Come on, it's all very simple. Austria is waging a war against Serbia. By the time all this other stuff happens, Europe already has a war on its hands. Austria is waging a war against Serbia. And that is a very strong point, and it has to be countered carefully. It has to be addressed carefully. It seems to me, and I don't want to go into all the detail, but it seems to me that we have to ask ourselves, what are the Austrian options? What can they do after this assassination? Now, let's not forget the young men. It becomes clear within 36 hours that the bombs and guns are of Serbian manufacture. That doesn't necessarily tell you very much. They could have just picked them up from Komitadjis who'd been fighting during the Balkan Wars. That's true. But then they come into, they're also established within a couple of days that they were helped across the border by a network of customs agents. That all becomes clear. Danilo Ilic, the guy who recruited the local people in Sarajevo, he tells them a lot more about the people who are involved in planning this in Belgrade. It becomes clear that they had marksmanship practice in a park outside Belgrade. They come across the name of Ciganovic. They ask Belgrade about where they want Ciganovic to be arrested. Belgrade says, we've never heard of anyone called Ciganovic. Ciganovic, it turns out, is not only a member of the Black Hand, but also quite possibly, or highly probably, an agent of Pasic, the Prime Minister of Serbia. So the Austrians are in the process of getting closer and closer to the background of this, though they never realized the full extent of the relationship between Serbian military intelligence and the assassinations. So in the face of that, of course, they're going to want to demand compliance with some sort of demands, right? They're going to be making demands against Belgrade. How do the Russians and the French and the British respond to this? Well, they say, it doesn't matter how this started, there are going to be no demands. No demand is just, is acceptable. Sazonov makes this clear. He says, and the Tsar also says, any demands are tantamount with planning war. We're not going to accept that. There's a lot of talk of Serbian sovereignty. And we've heard this more recently, right? Syrian sovereignty and so on. Serbia is a sovereign state. Any demand which in any way impinges on Serbian sovereignty will not be acceptable to the Entente powers. Poincaré tells the Austrian ambassador in Paris, there is no connection between this assassination and Vienna and Belgrade. Absolutely none. You'll never prove this because there is none. Now, how he knows that is a mystery because Poincaré has made no independent study of this. But that's the position taken by the French and the Russians. There is no case here for Belgrade to answer. And of course, the Serbs take exactly the same position, encouraged by their Entente partners. They say, we're not going to collaborate. They don't even get rid of APIS. the chief of Serbian military intelligence, and Pasic knows perfectly well that APIS is behind all of this. We know that from internal correspondence in which Pasic himself had tried to shut down these networks that are involved in this trafficking of young men and bombs and guns across the border. So in other words, it's a complex situation. I'm not going to say that I think the Austrians were right to invade Serbia, or that they had a right to do so, or that this was a legitimate act. Great powers often behave illegitimately, and they're still doing so today. They've been doing so in the last few weeks. So, that's the way they behave, and that's the way the Austrians behaved, and it's clearly part of the story of how this war came about. But I don't think I'd want to make that the, as it were, the single decisive, cause of the outbreak of the war, and then put it, as it were, at Vienna's doorstep. I think it's more complex than that.
I'd like you to join me in thanking Professor Clark for...
Thank you very much.